Donald Trump's singular determination to prevent World War III and to dismantle the globalist economic system is forcing the British Empire into more desperate and exposed actions, like maybe a nuclear confrontation between India and Pakistan, or Israel seizing all of Gaza, or the open reemergence of fascist political tactics throughout Europe. People are fighting back here in the United States and elsewhere, but it's not enough to fight. Millions of Americans fought their hearts out in 2022, and we lost ground, and we could lose more ground in 2026. You have to fight effectively as we head into 2026, and that means understanding the battle terrain and knowing your enemy. For example, did you know that the Democratic Party is largely run by a British private investment firm? If you want to defeat the Democrats in 2026, you better understand just what is running them. This is Susan Kokinda, and I'm going to return to that later in this midweek update. But let's start with the British role in today's strategic battles. Tomorrow, May 8th, is Victory Day, celebrating the defeat of fascism in Europe. More than 24 heads of state, including China's Xi Jinping, will be in Moscow for Russia's commemoration. Ukraine, which has kept alive the Nazi tradition with its protection of the Banderist movement, has issued threats against that event. There are those in Ukraine who are not happy with the outcome of World War II. Now think about this. The United States in recent decades has taken very little notice of VE Day. But last week, President Trump announced his intention to change that. And he truthed out. Many of our allies and friends are celebrating May 8th as Victory Day. But we did more than any other country in producing a victorious result in World War II. But we never celebrate anything. That's because we don't have leaders anymore that know how to do so. We're going to start celebrating victories again. But let's look a little deeper into why we have largely ignored VE Day. It has everything to do with the unfinished business of World War II, namely that Franklin Roosevelt died before he could fulfill his intention, which he told directly to Winston Churchill at Casablanca, to dismantle the British Empire and establish a world of sovereign nations. We've been living with the consequences of that ever since. It's called globalism, free trade, and perpetual war. President Trump, more than any president in the post-war period, is committed to finishing that business of dismantling empire. And this is what the British kill over. Promethean Action is committed to giving you the tools to defend President Trump and finish that mission. And I encourage you to subscribe to Promethean Action, and better yet, support us with a contribution or a monthly membership, because you will not get the kind of strategic grounding that we give you anywhere else. So if you look at the breadth and speed of President Trump's diplomatic offensives, you see someone who is driven and has been driven for decades by the passionate commitment to end the empire's wars, and in particular, the threat of nuclear war. In her Monday update, Barbara referenced the comments of an attendee at a recent White House dinner who said that the only thing on the president's mind was preventing nuclear war. And in each of the complex and often long-standing conflicts that the president is trying to settle, he comes back to one idea: the killing has to stop. Yesterday, for example, in his meeting with the new Pro-Council of Canada, Mark Carney, Trump announced the end of U.S. bombing of the Houthis because, quote, they don't want to fight, quote, anymore. Look at the continuing discussions with Iran over its nuclear program. Donald Trump does not want this to come to war. He does have a red line. Iran cannot have nuclear weapons, but he wants to get there through negotiations. Remember, Trump sprang the announcement of the resumption of U.S.-Iran negotiations on Bibi Netanyahu in the Oval Office on April 7th, where one of Bibi's goals was to try and convince the U.S. to support the bombing of Iran. There's a lot of press and source reports floating around that claim National Security Advisor Mike Waltz was canned not because of Signalgate, but because he had a private meeting with Netanyahu before Netanyahu's meeting with Trump, and that Waltz was in sync with Bibi on Iran, not with the president. Next week, Trump will travel to Saudi Arabia for his first official state visit, which mirrors what he did in his first term, where Saudi Arabia was his first official visit, and where he laid down the law that the Saudi support for British-fostered Islamic extremism had to end, and it largely did. There are also rumors that that visit may end with a meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Saudi Arabia. But however all the details play out, Trump is committed to kicking over the post-war British set-up geopolitical chessboard. And that chessboard must be destroyed forever before it does get us into a nuclear war. Yesterday, the confrontation between India and Pakistan, triggered by the April 22nd murder of a group of Indian tourists in the disputed region of Kashmir, got hotter, with India militarily striking what they called terrorist camps inside Pakistan, and Pakistan vowing to retaliate. While both sides have pledged not to use nuclear weapons, which they both possess, the danger can't be ignored. If you look at both the flashpoints of the India-Pakistan conflict and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you find a common thread. It was the British Empire which drew the borders that have created these cockpits for war. In the case of the subcontinent, it was the post-war partition of India. And in the Mideast, you can go back to the Sykes-Picot Treaty after World War I. Or look at how the British redrew the geopolitical map of the world with Winston Churchill's Cold War speech in Fulton, Missouri in 1946. For 80 years, the British have sought to keep the United States at loggerheads with its World War II allies, Russia and China, orchestrating dozens of side conflicts as part of that chess game, which have killed millions of people. Hence the importance of President Trump's announcement that we will now be celebrating Victory Day. What the British were and are afraid of is the reemergence of the American system in all of its economic, strategic, and cultural power, as well they should. Look at Donald Trump's impact on Europe. Despite the fascist tactics of the global elite, which have sought to literally nullify elections or ban the opposition to their policies in places like Romania, France, and Germany, a concerted resistance is emerging. After his predecessor's election was nullified, the Romanian opposition leader Simeon won the first round in elections in early May. And in Germany, where the opposition party has been declared a terrorist organization, the new globalist-approved chancellor candidate failed to get a parliamentary approval on the first vote to install him as chancellor. That is the first time in post-war history that has happened. So the efforts to simply nullify opposition really are not working. But most importantly, look at what Donald Trump is doing to revive the real identity of the United States as a producer nation, flourishing in manufacturing and science and technology. It's impossible to give justice to the sweep of this administration's economic actions in its first 100 days. We have a very important post on our website entitled, "What We Produce, Not What We Buy," by Brian Lance, which summarizes a longer analysis which he has written, and which strikes directly at the theme of the American producer identity. Our newsletter will continue to carry unique posts on the importance of this, and again, I urge you to subscribe. This is something that I'm very focused on here in Michigan, which is probably the most important state in the upcoming 2026 elections, with an open Senate seat and 2 open House seats up for grabs. But it holds for the entire country. In a speech in Alabama last week, President Trump told Americans, "Build your country, not your portfolio." The success of President Trump's economic revolution and the victories we will need in 2026 is going to come because enough Americans will have changed their identities from subjects or victims to citizens, from consumers to producers. The British control over post-war America did not come through military occupation. It came about over the decades by undermining our sense of purpose. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent referenced this a few weeks ago when he identified the Democratic Party's strategy of compensating the losers. In other words, you destroy the ability of the average American to provide for his or her family with one income. You turn people into losers. scrambling to figure out how they can cobble together enough money to make it. You turn them into consumers who care about whether they will have to pay 10% more for a piece of cheap crap on Amazon. But Besson said American workers are not losers. They're producers, and that it's the system that hasn't worked for them. That is the system which is broken. And our founding fathers knew what it was, and they gave it a name. It is the British system which is broken. Now go back to Besson's comments about the Democratic Party, which has been the enforcer for that British system for most of the post-war period. It wasn't under JFK, and it wouldn't have been under Robert Kennedy, but I think you get the idea. This week, there was an explosive report published in the Federalist entitled, "Meet the Wealthy Private Firms Controlling the Democratic Party." Well, that headline buries the lead. It's not just wealthy private firms. It's the British. The author, Logan Washburn, documents that significant portions of the Democratic Party's get out the vote, voter engagement, and funding apparatus is controlled by a British private equity firm called Apax. This includes the organizing and funding for the anti-Tesla and hands-off protests that were spawned throughout the country. We are going to have much more to say about this in coming updates and posts. You don't want to miss any of our ongoing coverage, so please, again, subscribe. But as a teaser, here's a little background on the founder of Apax Capital, Sir Richard Cohen. He's known as the father of British venture capitalism and social investing, and he checks all the boxes. Oxford, Harvard, World Economic Forum, everything the Democratic Party has become as a tool of the social engineers who want you to be a victim or a loser in a shrinking dystopian society is what Sir Richard is all about. He's like the private venture capital twin of the new Canadian Prime Minister, Mark Carney, who played a similar role as head of the Bank of England. Shattering that victim mentality among more and more of our fellow citizens is the key to consolidating Trump's economic revolution and forcing Congress into line behind him. When you understand the power, physically and culturally, that develops by becoming a proud producing nation, pushing the frontiers of science and technology, you will do everything you can to demand that Congress enact the full scope of the president's policies, whether it's on taxes, whether it's on space, whether it's on economic mobilization. And when people make their decisions from the standpoint of building our nation and the future, and not, as the president said, our portfolios, they will vote the right way in 2026. This has been your Midweek Update. Thank you for watching.
Please take a moment and subscribe to our free newsletter at prometheanaction.com.